At its height, the British Empire was the largest empire in history, controlling nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. It was a superpower that seemed unstoppable. But within just a few decades, it all came crashing down. How did one of the most dominant forces in global history unravel so quickly? Was it the cost of 2 world wars, economic struggles, rebellions in the colonies? Or was it simply the natural fate of all empires? At the turn of the 20th century, Britain ruled over vast territories, from India to Africa to the Caribbean. By the late 20th century, almost all of these colonies had gained independence. The empire was gone. The fall of the British Empire wasn't the result of one single event, but a combination of internal weaknesses and external pressures that made its collapse inevitable. The British Empire's expansion was rapid and relentless. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it stretched across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. It was so vast that people said the sun never sets on the British Empire. But here's the problem. The bigger an empire gets, the harder it is to control. Governing distant territories required massive resources, military presence, and constant administration. The British relied heavily on local elites, trade, and military power to keep their grip on the colonies. However, with such an enormous empire came challenges. Maintaining control meant crushing uprisings, enforcing British rule, and constantly expanding military efforts. Over time, this overstretch made the empire vulnerable. The more territories Britain controlled, the more resistance it faced. And then came a series of events that shook the foundation of British power, 2 devastating world wars. World War I, 1914 to 1918, was the first major blow. Britain, along with its allies, emerged victorious, but at a devastating cost. The war drained Britain's economy, national debt soared, and industries struggled to recover. The empire's colonies provided millions of soldiers and resources, but resentment grew among colonized nations. Many demanded more independence in return for their sacrifices. Then just 2 decades later, World War II, 1939 to 1945, delivered an even greater financial disaster. Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy and had to borrow heavily from the United States. The war weakened Britain's military and global influence, allowing the rise of 2 new superpowers, the USA and the USSR. Britain lost its ability to control its empire effectively. After 1945, it became clear Britain could no longer afford to maintain its empire. But economic troubles weren't the only issue. Nationalist movements across the empire were growing stronger. As Britain weakened, colonies began fighting for their independence. And the biggest blow came from India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. For decades, Indian leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru had been pushing for independence. After World War II, Britain could no longer suppress the movement. In 1947, India and Pakistan gained independence, marking the beginning of the empire's collapse. India's independence inspired anti-colonial movements across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Kenya, the Mau Mau Rebellion, 1950s, saw brutal fighting between British forces and Kenyan nationalists. Malaysia. The British faced a 12-year insurgency during the Malayan Emergency. Egypt and the Middle East, nationalism surged, leading to revolts and conflicts. Even in the Caribbean and the Pacific, colonies demanded self-rule. Britain realized that holding on to its empire would require endless wars and economic strain. But then came a moment that exposed Britain's true weakness to the world, the Suez Crisis of 1956. In 1956, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital trade route controlled by Britain and France. Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a military invasion to take it back. But there was a problem. The USA and the Soviet Union opposed the attack. The Americans, who had now surpassed Britain in global power, forced Britain to withdraw. The Suez Crisis was a turning point. It showed that Britain was no longer a dominant force in world affairs. If it couldn't even control a canal, how could it hold on to an empire? This event accelerated decolonization. Nations across Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia saw Britain's weakness and pushed harder for independence. Within a few decades, most of the empire was gone. Even after the wars, Britain struggled to recover economically. The country was in debt, industries were failing, and the empire was no longer profitable. Meanwhile, the world had changed. The USA and the USSR became the new global superpowers, shaping world politics. Britain had no choice but to focus on its own economy and rebuild itself. At the same time, Europe was forming new alliances, like the European Economic Community, EEC, shifting power away from the British Empire. Britain was no longer the center of the world. It was just another country in a new global order. By the 1980s, most British colonies had gained independence. The empire had officially ended. The final symbolic moment came in 1997, when Britain handed over Hong Kong to China. This marked the last major piece of the empire slipping away, but the British Empire left a lasting impact on the world. English became a global language. Many former colonies still follow British-style governance. Many post-colonial regions face political struggles due to past British rule. Even though the empire is gone, its influence still shapes the modern world. The fall of the British Empire was inevitable. The cost of war, economic struggles, rising nationalism, and shifting global power all led to its collapse. No empire lasts forever. Even the most powerful can crumble under their own weight. The British Empire, once the largest in history, collapsed because it simply could not sustain itself. What do you think? Could Britain have held on to its empire longer, or was its fall unavoidable? Comment below.